public lecture series. Alan Buchanan is James E. Duke Professor of Philosophy at Duke University and also affiliated with the Institute of Genome Sciences and Policy at Duke University. He has received his BA degree from Columbia University and his PhD degree from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research spans bioethics, philosophy, international law, and political philosophy. He was also very active as a consultant for a number of councils and committees, including U.S. President Council on Bioethics. He is the author of over 100 articles and a dozen or more so books. I'll just mention a few of their names of those books. Beyond Humanity, The Ethics of Biomedical Enhancement from Oxford University Press, published just this year. Justice and Healthcare, Selected Essays, again, Oxford University Press. Human Rights, Legitimacy, and the Use of Force, again, Oxford University Press. And also Justice, Legitimacy, and Self-Determination, Moral Foundations for International Law. And I'll also mention From Chance to Choice, Genetics and Justice, a co-authored book from Cambridge University Press. We're very happy to have Alan. The floor is yours.
Thank you.
He specifically advised me to keep the introduction short.
Yes.
I follow his instruction.
Well, I'm very happy to be here. I'm benefiting from Turkish hospitality. I've never been to Turkey before, and I'm enjoying it enormously. It'll be hard to get me to leave, in fact. And I want to thank Gurl especially for being my host here at the university. Now, this is a talk that's based on a co-authored paper, and the other author just happens to be sitting right here, Russell Powell. So if you have any deep criticisms or difficult questions, I'll just turn it over to Russell and he'll answer, because he is the first author. And I'd just like to mention, in case I forget to say this at the end of the period, that Russell is giving a paper on Monday in this room at the same time, which is a natural sequel to this paper. So if you find this interesting, or if you don't find it interesting, I encourage you to come hear Russell. Now let's see. Uh-oh.
I think for some reason you're not clicking into it.
Well, it's doing it a moment ago. Let's see. Let me try this. Okay, I'll just use the arrow key is not working. The enter key is okay. There are three quotations that are mottos for this talk. The first one is from Alfred Lord Tennyson, who was the poet laureate, the official poet of England in the 19th century, the mid-19th century. And in one of his poems, he describes nature as red in tooth and claw, and the red means bloody. And then a favorite quotation from Darwin in a letter to Joseph Hooker: "What a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering, low, and horridly cruel works of nature." And finally, a quotation from one of my favorite novels, The Leopard by Lampudesa: "If we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change." It's paradoxical, but it turns out to be quite true. So Tennyson says nature's bloody, Darwin says it's bloody and inept, that is clumsy, blundering. And Tancredi says sometimes we have to change in order to preserve what we have. Now I'm going to be talking about biomedical enhancement. And roughly by biomedical enhancement, I mean simply using biomedical technologies to improve existing normal human capacities, or perhaps more radically to create a new capacity that human beings have never had. And the biomedical means could be of many different sorts. It could be a matter of taking a drug. It could be something radical like genetic engineering of embryos. It could be computer-brain interface technology. So that's what BE stands for, biomedical enhancement. And there are a number of concerns that people have voiced about the prospect of our using biomedical enhancements, and here are, I think, some of the most serious concerns. People worry about damaging or destroying human nature or undermining natural human relationships. They worry, of course, about unintended bad consequences, whether biological or social consequences of these kinds of interventions. They have concerns about character. Some people, like Michael Sandel at Harvard University, thinks that the very desire to enhance ourselves shows that there's something wrong with our character, that we're pursuing total mastery or perfection. He thinks that biomedical technologies, enhancement technologies, can be corrupting in this way. Other people are worried about issues of distributive injustice. They're worried that people who are already very rich and fortunate will gain even greater advantages if they're able to use biomedical enhancements, assuming that other people won't be able to afford to use them. And then finally, there are what are called dual-use concerns. Some people are worried that technologies that are developed for seemingly positive reasons to enhance us, to make us better, might be used for wrongful purposes, deliberately used, not a matter of unintended bad consequences, but intended bad consequences. Just as now we've developed biotechnologies that can help us combat epidemics, those same technologies might be used as weapons of bioterrorism. So similarly, for example, the US government is investing a lot of money in trying to enhance soldiers. And some of us think that this might not be a good idea. And that the techniques that are developed to intervene in the mental operations of soldiers might be used for even more problematic purposes. Now, I'm going to focus in this talk on bad unintended consequences, and we can distinguish biological versus social consequences and focus on biological consequences, and in particular on the risk of intentional germline genetic modifications aimed at enhancement, or IGM. And by germline, I mean interventions into human embryos or into gametes, into either sperm or eggs, to change the genetic composition with the aim of enhancing some human capacity. And many people think that this kind of enhancement technology is the most problematic, the most dangerous, the riskiest. They're worried in particular about unintended bad consequences that would be passed on to the next generation, because this is modification of the human germline. Now, here are two common views of why intentional genetic modifications are especially risky. Some people, as I just suggested, think that they would produce irreversible changes. That's actually a mistake. We have to distinguish between changing genes and the effects of changing genes. And sometimes we can change genes, and if the consequences of changing the gene turn out to be bad, we can block those consequences and prevent the bad consequences from occurring. So even if we make a mistake in changing genes, it doesn't follow that we're going to get a bad outcome. More about that in a moment. The second reason why some people believe that this is an especially risky and problematic kind of biomedical enhancement is that they think that IGM somehow interferes with the wisdom of nature, that it tampers irresponsibly with the work of what you might call the master engineer of evolution. Now, on the first worry, as I just suggested, it's a mistake to think that if you make a genetic alteration and it looks like it would have bad consequences, you're stuck with the consequences. That fails to distinguish between the genes and the traits that are the expression of the genes. We can control the expression of genes, and it's the consequences that count, not the genetic changes per se. In laboratory animals, it's already possible to make germline genetic modifications to insert new genes into, say, a mouse embryo. And then if it turns out that this has a bad unintended consequence, it's possible to avoid that consequence by blocking the expression of the gene. And this can be done in a couple of different ways. It's possible to modify the genes that you insert into the embryo so that the gene won't switch on or express unless you administer a chemical to trigger the expression. But also, if it's just a gene that operates in the ordinary way and would get switched on by biochemical signals being given from the mouse's system, it's possible to administer a drug to block the expression of the gene. So genetic change doesn't mean necessarily you're stuck with a change in the traits. Now, I want to focus on this second concern, the concern that somehow by engaging in IGM, intentional genetic modification, we're irresponsibly interfering with the master engineer of evolution. And what Russell and I do in this paper on which this talk is based is to criticize this analogy between evolution, and in particular natural selection as it operates in evolution, and a master engineer. That is, we think it's wrong to think of evolution, or nature if you don't want to use the evolutionary talk, as a master engineer. And we think that once you realize how different evolution is from the work of a master engineer, you'll become at least more receptive to the idea of intentional genetic modification. Here's the master engineer analogy. It's a way of thinking about evolved organisms like you and I, or other organisms that have been produced by evolution. Thinking of the organism as a finely balanced, complete, optimal, harmonious product, as if it were made by a master engineer. Now, if that's the way you think of evolved organisms like you and I, then it's pretty obvious that our interfering with that is foolish and irresponsible. It's tampering with the work of a master engineer. And this is exactly what's said in President Bush's Council on Bioethics book-length report, Beyond Therapy. It's also said by some people, Nick Bostrom and Anders Sandberg at Oxford, who are much more friendly to biomedical enhancement than the Bush Council was. The Bush Council is very negative, very much opposed to biomedical enhancement. Bostrom and Sandberg are much more friendly toward biomedical enhancement, including genetic modification, but like Bush's council, they still use this analogy of the master engineer. Now, there's a famous analogy used by the evolutionary theorist Richard Dawkins. He has a book called The Blind Watchmaker. He says that evolution working through natural selection is like a blind watchmaker. And Russell and I think that that's much too charitable, that evolution is not even as good as a blind watchmaker. A blind watchmaker, even though he's blind, knows in advance what he wants to produce. He wants to produce a watch. And a watch is something that satisfies human needs. Evolution working through natural selection is not like that at all. It's not about producing things to satisfy human needs. And it's not an operation which proceeds with a plan in mind in advance. Instead, Russell and I think that a more accurate analogy or metaphor for evolution is that it's like a morally blind, fickle, tightly shackled tinkerer. That's even worse than a blind watchmaker in some respects. And I'll explain why each of these adjectives is appropriate. So here's the strategy. I want to compare intentional genetic modification with unintentional genetic modification. That is, the kind of modification of genes that just occurs as a matter of course through evolution, operating, at least in significant part, through natural selection, without deliberate human efforts to change genes. And the idea is to compare these as if they were sort of two different technologies, intentional genetic modification and the technology that's expressed in evolution as it ordinarily occurs, and see which of them looks more promising from the standpoint of either improving the human condition or even preventing it from getting worse. And Russell's talk on Monday will go much further into the second part about what we may need to do in order to prevent human life from getting worse. I'm going to focus somewhat on that, but more on the issue of how we can improve ourselves. And roughly whether we should just rely on evolution as usual and hope that we'll improve our condition, or whether we need to take a more deliberate, intentional approach and use IGM. Now, to try to make the case that evolution works more like a morally blind, fickle, tightly shackled tinkerer than a master engineer, we have to say something about what evolution is like. And this is where the Darwin quote comes in. I won't repeat it, but the big point is that ordinary evolution, UGM, unintentional genetic modification, is not like a master engineer. That suboptimal design is both pervasive and necessary in evolution. It's not just a quirk or an exceptional situation that evolution produces suboptimal design. It's inherent in the way evolution works, at least so far as natural selection is concerned, that it's going to produce design flaws. And this is just something to keep in mind. Sometimes people talk as if what Darwin did was to show that intelligent design is possible without God. But I think that's really inaccurate. It's more accurate to say that he showed how we can explain diversity and change in nature without intelligent design. That's the point of his statement that nature is clumsy and blundering. In a sense, not very intelligent. Here are some examples of poor design in human beings, okay? And the list could be added to. There are lots of poor design features in humans. The urinary tract in male mammals, including humans, the urethra passes through, not around the prostate gland, and this results in infections and loss of urinary function. The sinuses in primates, including humans, are very poorly engineered. In fact, some of the sinuses would work much better if we stood on our heads all the time. They don't drain well, and this has caused innumerable headaches and infections in primates, including humans, for a very long time. Human beings, unlike most mammals, cannot produce vitamin C simply out of what they eat. And that's caused huge health problems in human beings for a very long time. The human pharynx is a very oddly engineered apparatus. If you were a biomedical engineering student and designed a pharynx looking like ours, you would get a failing grade for it, because it combines both air intake and food intake, and this leads to high risk of death by choking. The females in the audience can appreciate this. The human birth canal is not very well engineered for having offspring with large heads like human beings tend to have. And then also, I can relate to this one. I could have also said knee problems too. Lower back, our ancestors shifted from being quadrupeds to being bipedal fairly quickly. And this is one of many illustrations where, if you want to use a metaphor, evolution doesn't look ahead. It responds to a present need. In this case, probably the need of our ancestors to be able to range over larger distances to gather food. And you can do that better if you walk on 2 feet. It also frees up your hands for doing things. But there was no forethought of the problems that this would cause later, especially with regard to the lower back. Now, there was a famous article by Thomas Nagel many years ago called "What It's Like to Be a Bat." I happened to be present when this article was this paper was first given 35 years ago. And he speculated about what the consciousness of a bat would be like. Well, I'm not going to talk about that, but I'm going to say something else about bats. And that is, bats are engineered in an odd way. They spend a good deal of their time hanging upside down with their heads down, hanging from their feet with their heads down. But their digestive tracts are set up just like those of other mammals. And the result is that a large proportion of their life is spent hanging upside down, defecating all over themselves. Okay? So if I wanted to be graphic, I'd take a tube of toothpaste and hold it with this opening up here and squeeze it, and as the stuff ran all over my hand, that's what it's like to be a bat. Okay? And it causes diseases, rampant infectious diseases that spread among bats because they're packed together very tightly in their colonies, hanging upside down, defecating all over themselves.
And yet they're very successful.
That's right. If you were again an engineering student and your project was to design a flying mammal, it would not look very much like a bat. I'm sure you would have better ideas. Now, why do we see these design flaws? Why are they so ubiquitous in our species and other species? The best way to think about that is to think about the constraints or limitations on unintentional genetic modification if we consider it as a process for improving human life or even for sustaining it. That is, what are its limitations? There are a number of them. Here's one that I'm becoming more and more aware of the older I get, and that is that natural selection doesn't really do very much for us in post-reproductive years, right? Because what natural selection does, or tends to do, is to approximate reproductive fitness. But what this means is that if you live post-reproductive age, then your body will accumulate all sorts of problems, but there won't be any investment, as it were, by the organism in repairing those flaws because there's no payoff in terms of your reproductive fitness. And this turns out to be disastrous for us because we're living much, much longer. And during the period when we're living longer, past reproductive age, we're accumulating all sorts of medical problems which will not be winnowed out. They will not be removed by natural selection. That's a real problem. In contrast, if we look at IgM, in principle, IgM could avoid or ameliorate these harms that result from UGM's insensitivity to post-reproductive quality of life. There are genes which play an important role in either causing cancer or in suppressing cancer, and it will be possible, it's already being done with laboratory animals, to modify those genes, for example, to ramp up, to increase the tumor suppressing action of some genes. And of course, cancer is one of the serious problems that you're more prone to in later post-reproductive years. It may also be possible to modify genetic networks that regulate the hormones which affect our muscles as we grow older. As we grow older, hormone levels get reduced, and there's less regeneration of muscles. The quality of the muscle fibers deteriorates, and this plays a role in the frailty we associate with old age. Here's another constraint or limitation of unintentional genetic modification. It's important to remember that natural selection does not imply optimality, even if we understand optimality narrowly as reproductive fitness. That is, as maximizing the number of genes that you pass on to the next generation. And it's important to realize this because if you look at this locution, trait X has been selected for by natural selection, or X is an adaptation, that's really a claim about the past. It's not a claim about the present or the future. It just means that that trait at some point in the past was something that increased reproductive fitness. But whether the trait is currently optimal from the standpoint of reproductive fitness is an entirely different matter. Things that might have been conducive to reproductive fitness in the past may now not be conducive to reproductive fitness. They may actually be things that decrease reproductive fitness. Why? Because the environment may have changed. Whether a trait is something that's conducive to reproductive fitness depends upon the relationship between having the trait and being in a particular environment. Optimality, just understood in this narrow way as what's conducive to reproductive fitness, is only fleetingly approximated by natural selection. So just because an organism has a certain trait, it doesn't follow that there's something good about that trait, even from the narrow perspective of just looking at reproductive fitness. Something that was optimal from the standpoint of reproductive fitness may now be fatal. The current organism is not the apex, the summit of eons of exacting evolution. That's from President Bush's council book. Existing organisms are not superior in design to extinct ones. I mean, when I was a child in school and was taught about evolution, the picture I got was that evolution is progress, and that the existing version of the chicken or the human being was the best version, right? As if there had been a constant environment and we were constantly getting better at living in our environment because of changes that were occurring through natural selection. That's the wrong picture. So evolution isn't progressive, even from this narrow standpoint of reproductive fitness. It's not progress in fitness. Another constraint or limitation on UGM, if you're thinking about it as something that could improve human well-being or preserve the well-being we have now, what's optimal in the biological sense, that is what's most conducive to reproductive fitness, is not the same as, and in fact may be at odds with, what we rightly value. So optimal in the evolutionary sense doesn't mean good, doesn't mean good for us. For example, it might turn out that if you really wanted to maximize reproductive fitness, that is, maximize the number of genes that the current generation is passing on to the next generation, that's not the most valuable thing to do. In fact, the best way to do that might be to just have as many children as possible compatible with them all living at a subsistence level and reproducing madly like rabbits, passing on their genes, even if this meant that the quality of human life was extremely low. Quality of human life and reproductive fitness are just different things. Also, another constraint under UGM, unintentional genetic modification, the spread of desirable mutations may be too slow, and it may occur at too great a cost in human terms. For example, in the past, there was a process that led to most human beings having some genes that provide resistance against epidemics. Most of us have resistance to bubonic plague. Perhaps also many people have resistance to smallpox, but how did that occur? It occurred by untold thousands of deaths of human beings, so that the people who didn't have genes that conferred resistance were eliminated from the population, couldn't pass on their genes to future populations. It's already been discovered that there are some human beings now who have a natural resistance to some strains of HIV infection. But we can't count on those genes spreading through the human population. They might be wiped out. The people that have them might die from some other kind of cause. But even if they do spread, they'll spread very, very slowly, and in the meantime, many millions of people will die of HIV. With intentional genetic modification, it may be possible to identify extremely beneficial genes and then accelerate the process of their spreading through the human population. So that's a big advantage of IgM over UGM. Also, another limitation of UGM, in animals, as opposed to bacteria, there's very little lateral gene transfer. That is, the genes that are available to a species are almost exclusively the genes that are in a particular lineage. They're genes that have to be passed down through sexual reproduction. But with some other organisms, bacteria in particular, they're able to latch on to genes in their environment and incorporate them into their own genomes without having to receive them through a vertical process over time in a particular lineage. We already know how to take advantage of this with intentional genetic modification in laboratory animals. We can introduce genes from one lineage of mice into mice in another lineage. We can introduce human genes into mice in order to make them better models for studying human diseases. And in principle, we should be able to do that with humans as well. And what that means is that with intentional genetic modification, you have a huge storehouse of materials for improving human beings that you wouldn't have access to with unintentional genetic modification. That's why we think of, if you use an analogy, we think of the tinkerer as being tightly shackled. It's as if it's a worker that's shackled to a desk in the middle of a huge warehouse filled with all sorts of wonderful building materials, but the tinkerer can't reach them, can only reach the genes that are the materials that are on the table in front of him. Whereas with intentional genetic modification, the individual could move around the warehouse, gather the best materials from wherever they come from, and use them for human well-being. Another problem with evolution as usual is what we call Pleistocene hangovers. That is, something that was adaptive, a trait that was adaptive for us to have in the evolutionary environment of adaptation may now be maladaptive. What's the EEA? Well, most evolutionary biologists think that most of the basic biological equipment of human beings that makes us a distinctive species was established a long time ago during the Pleistocene period. And since then, there have been some changes. For example, prevalence of some genes that confer resistance against disease, but that most of what makes us humans was established many tens of thousands of years ago. And it was established because it was a set of traits that was selected for in that environment. And that environment was radically different from the environment that we find ourselves in now. Yet we're living with the consequences of that earlier natural selection. And some people think that among the traits that might have been valuable, at least from the standpoint of reproductive fitness, in the Pleistocene era, are now things that we regard as very bad, as potentially very dangerous for human beings. A propensity towards xenophobia, to fearing and being hostile toward foreigners or strangers, a propensity to stepchild abuse, especially on the part of males abusing their stepchildren. There is an evolutionary explanation from the standpoint of reproductive fitness about why males that have this tendency would tend to pass on more genes. Obviously, they would be stopping the competing genes of other males from being passed on. And also, some people think that what we call a disorder, attention deficit disorder, may not have been a disorder at all in an earlier environment. Attention deficit disorder is disproportionately present in males. And if you were a male hunter in the Pleistocene era, it might have been a very good thing for you to be able to detect what's going on in the periphery of your vision. And you wouldn't have much need for being able to sit and concentrate on a computer screen for hours on end, or look at a textbook for hours on end. Now, as long as these Pleistocene hangovers don't currently interfere with our reproductive fitness in a serious way, there's no reason to believe they're going to be winnowed out by evolution. We may just be stuck with them unless we take some deliberate action to reduce them. So, evolution, master engineer? I don't think so. It's fickle in the sense that it often doesn't finish products. It just starts making a change in response to some current demand of the environment, and then it may simply move on to something else without carrying through the modification to a satisfactory point. It's morally blind in the sense that it doesn't aim at human good. It's not concerned with human good. It's about, if it's about anything, it's about reproductive fitness, and that's quite different from human good. And when it does achieve human good, it does it just by coincidence. And even when it achieves human good, it may do so by methods that are very costly in human terms. For example, we may get to a point where more of us have resistance to HIV infection, but getting there is going to be a bloody process. It's tightly shackled, as I said, because it only has access to genes that are being passed on by sexual reproduction in a lineage. It's a tinkerer, not really an engineer, because it doesn't have a plan. So it's not even like a blind watchmaker. A blind watchmaker has a plan, knows that he's trying to produce a watch. here's another problem with the master engineer analogy. It encourages the mistake of thinking that the choice that you and I are now confronted with is between, on the one hand, making risky changes in the name of improvement, that is, undertaking enhancements, or resting content with the status quo. But in the case of unintentional genetic modification, the status quo is constantly changing and precarious, and it may not track human good. So the existing human organism is not a finely balanced, stable, completed product that will continue as it is if only we don't intervene. That's the mistake. Don't think of it that way. Don't think that we've sort of reached the end of evolution and here we are with this complete stable organism and all we have to do is keep hands off and we'll continue the way we are. That's the wrong picture. We have every reason to believe that we'll keep changing. And unless we do something different from what every other organism has done in the past, we'll go extinct. Instead, the process is the one that produces an unstable, internally conflicted, flawed entity that vainly attempts to keep up with changes in the environment. This is Van Valen's Red Queen conjecture that the organism is like the Red Queen in Through the Looking Glass, constantly running in place faster and faster just to keep from falling down or from going backwards. And this brings up the relevance of Tancredi's remark in The Leopard. If things are to stay the same, things will have to change. Okay? It might turn out that, forget about improvement, just to sustain the status quo, to keep the level of human well-being as high as it is now, we may have to engage in some deliberate interventions. It may not be safe enough to leave our fate to evolution as usual. We might have to enhance some human capacities in order to preserve the status quo. Here's some possible examples. We might need enhanced reproduction to counteract drastic declines in fertility due to environmental toxins. How many of you saw the film Children of Men? Do you know this film? The scenario is that something has gone wrong. It's not explained exactly what, but sort of a suggestion that maybe we've polluted the environment so much that human beings are infertile. There's only one woman on Earth that's fertile. Everybody else is infertile. That's the plot. Well, when I saw that film, I thought, wait a minute, what about reproductive technologies? If you've got a fertility problem, why don't you just start cloning people, right? Well, it's not clear that we've done enough to the environment, or we will, that we'll have this problem. Some people think that we might. There's evidence that pseudoestrogens in the environment are affecting male reproductive organs. How much they're affecting them, we don't know. And not just in humans, but in other species too. Another possibility would be that we'll need some biomedical enhancement of resistance to skin cancer if the ozone layer depletes. Okay. Right now, it's holding fairly stable because of one of the few successful environmental accords, the Montreal Agreement, but that might change. And this is something I already referred to. We might need biomedical enhancements to ensure what's called compression of morbidity or illness into the last years of increased lifespan. Remember I said we've already done well enough that we've increased life expectancy for many human beings on Earth. But the problem is, in this extended lifespan, we're getting more and more problems that won't be winnowed out by ordinary evolution. And so you might have a situation where maybe 20 years from now, many people will be living to be 120 years old. But the last 20 years will be really awful. I mean, right now, if you live to be 85, you have a 1/3 chance, a 1 in 3 chance of having Alzheimer's dementia. If you live to be 90, you have a 1 in 2 chance. You have a 50% chance of getting Alzheimer's dementia. And it goes up from there. And Alzheimer's dementia is only one of the problems that occur with extreme old age. So we might have a situation where people are living 20 years longer, but taken as a whole, their lives are worse than our lives are, because the last years are afflicted with so many mental and physical disabilities. So we might need to enhance our ability, the body's ability to repair itself prevent these degenerative diseases of old age, just to prevent things from getting worse. We might need enhancements of the immune system to counter threats posed by emerging infectious diseases. We might need cognitive enhancements or affective enhancements to our motives, our emotions, in order to enable us to cope better with major problems, right? We might need some combination of better thinking and better emotional responses to deal with problems that we've created. Remember, our cognition and our emotions are things that were developed a long time ago in a much simpler environment that had quite different demands on us than the one we face now. Now, there are people that are called bioconservatives who are very opposed to biomedical enhancement. President Bush's council was composed mainly of what you might call bioconservatives. And sometimes they use a different analogy or metaphor from the master engineer. Instead, they say that the individual organism is like a kind of seamless web. And sometimes, when they move out of the biomedical realm into the social realm, they think of society in the same way. They think of society as a seamless web. Everything is very interconnected with everything else. And they worry that we might try to change one part of that, thinking we're going to make a change for the better. And because everything's connected to everything else, the whole thing will unravel. There'll be disastrous bad consequences, unintended bad consequences. So that's what makes them conservatives, right? They think, no, things may not be perfect now, but don't try to improve them because everything's connected to everything else. You might think you're working on this and that changing would be an improvement, but it's connected to something else in ways we don't understand, and you may damage the good when trying to get rid of the bad, either in society or in the individual organism. The problem with these analogies, the seamless web analogy, is that it doesn't actually fit the facts either about societies or about individual evolved organisms. In the case of individual organisms, there are a number of biological features which make the seamless web analogy not very accurate. First, there's modularity of design. The human mind exhibits a lot of modularity. And a module, roughly, is a kind of system or subsystem that has denser connections among its own parts than it does have connections with things outside of it. Another way to put it is that what a module is something whose boundary is a seam. Okay, if you think of there being a big cloth, well, if modularization is present, it's as if it's a cloth that's composed of a bunch of different patches of material, and there are quite distinctive seams bounding the patches, so that if you cut the threads outside the boundary, it doesn't necessarily affect anything inside the boundary that's demarcated by another prominent seam. There's also a lot of redundancy of systems in biology, in human biology and in other biological systems. And what that means is that there's more than one way of doing the same thing, and it might be that you damage something, but if there's a backup system, then the results may not be so disastrous. There's something that's closely related, it's called canalization. Roughly the idea is that you can produce the same dish, the same meal, using different recipes. That is, canalization is the tendency of organisms to produce the same phenotype, the same sort of traits, across differences in genotype and environment. So it's not a simple matter that the only way you get this trait is by having this genotype. Sometimes you can have changes in genotype and changes in the environment, and you can nonetheless get the same trait. That's just another way of saying that things aren't quite as densely interconnected as the seamless web suggests. Also, and this is probably the most important point, the way natural selection works is very incrementally. It can only work if it's possible to change one trait in the organism without changing a lot of other traits. So for all of these reasons, the analogy of a seamless web is not a very accurate analogy. And that means we shouldn't be so ready to say, oh, let's not intervene at all, because we're like seamless webs. If we intervene, we're likely to unravel the whole thing. Having said all that, I don't want to minimize the fact that we do face risk if we ever decide to engage in deliberate intentional genetic modification. But it's all a question of how we frame the risk, and we shouldn't frame it in terms of interfering with the work of a master engineer or tampering with a seamless web. Now, in the biomedical enhancement literature, there's sort of two polar opposites. There are people who are bioconservatives who say, don't go there, just don't ever think about genetic modification of individuals for enhancement or any other reason. It's too dangerous, we're like seamless webs, we're products of a master engineer, et cetera. On the other hand, there are people who are more positive toward biomedical enhancements, including IgM, but they recognize that there are risks, and they just say very unilluminating things like, be careful, or go slowly, proceed with caution. But that doesn't really tell us much that's concrete that would enable us to reduce the risk. So what Russell and I try to do is to steer a course between these extremes and say something that recognizes that there are risks, but then helps us begin to think about how to cope with the risk. Now, if you're worried about unintended bad consequences of biomedical enhancement, you ought to focus on IgM because that's what people generally think is the most risky case. So that's what we do in the rest of the paper. And the suggestion, if you're thinking about IgM, is to think ontogeny. And ontogeny is just roughly the process of development in an individual organism from the embryo up through the major stages of development to a more complete organism. So since in IgM you're intervening very early, in a sperm or an egg or in an early embryo, then what you have to worry about most is inadvertently messing up the developmental process, the ontogenic process. So that's what you should focus on in terms of reducing risk. And what we suggest is a set of precautionary heuristics for IgM. That is, these are sort of a checklist of principles, and in each case, if you're considering some possible intentional genetic modification, you should go through this list, and if the proposal comes out positive on the more of these things that it comes out positive on, the more confident you should be that you've taken into account the most serious risk. It's not a recipe. It doesn't mean that if a proposed intervention satisfies all these things, then there's no risk involved. It's a matter of relative risk. First, other things being equal, an intervention that targets genes that lie downstream rather than upstream in the organism's developmental process is a safer intervention. You can think of the process as one in which there's a series of genes that are switched on at different times. And the genes that go into action earlier on in the process, in effect, have cascading effects for further downstream in the process. So other things being equal, if you make a change earlier on in the process and something goes wrong, it's likely to have more serious magnifying effects further down than if you made a change that was not so far upstream in the developmental process. So other things being equal, you should opt for the second kind of changes. Second, if the intervention, if successful, would not produce an enhancement that exceeds the upper bound of the current normal range, other things being equal, you should be more confident that it's less risky. Here's an example. Suppose you could do an intervention that would boost cognitive power, some aspect of thinking, memory or something. Or just say intelligence. If you think there's such a thing as intelligence measured by IQ test. Well, suppose you have a choice between doing an intervention that you think will result in producing somebody that has an IQ of 400 or 250 versus an intervention that will increase somebody's intelligence who would have had sort of normal intelligence to up near the highest end of the normal range of the intelligence distribution now. We think, other things being equal, you should go for the second intervention rather than the first. Why? Because we already know that there are some human beings who seem to function pretty well when they have IQs at the top of the normal distribution of intelligence. We don't have any examples of well-functioning human beings with an IQ of 250. Third, and this is one of the most important guidelines, the IgM's effects are containable within the organism. This is what people worry about with genetic modification of food crops. At least in part, they worry that you might make a genetic intervention to produce a seed for a corn or wheat, and then the genes from the seed may spread uncontrollably if the seeds blow around in the wind or somehow get outside of the experimental food plot. So containability within the organism makes sense, because if you make a mistake, the mistake will be restricted to that organism. Fourth, if the intervention involves a highly modularized system or subsystem, then you can be more confident that if you make a mistake in it, it's not going to have spillover effects into other systems. Fifth, the effects are reversible. I mentioned this earlier, right? If you make a genetic change and it turns out to have a bad phenotypic consequence, you're not necessarily stuck with the bad phenotypic consequence if you can deliberately block the expression of the gene. And also if you can prevent the gene from being passed on to future generations. Sixth, the intervention doesn't require major morphological changes. I don't know if you're familiar, there's a toy in the United States that's called Potato Head. It's a toy where you can sort of add things and take things off, and you can do almost anything, okay? Well, even though human beings aren't like seamless webs, they're not like potato heads either. You can't just stick things all together, right? There's a basic body plan, and there is enough interconnection among the parts of human beings that you're more likely to have a bad unintended consequence if you introduce a really radical change in the basic design. So that's probably something to stay away from, at least for a long time. Seventh, if the goal is to eliminate a trait, then the causal roles of both the trait and the genes targeted for elimination should be well understood. Okay, conclusions, and then I want to preview Russell's talk just a little bit on his talk on Monday. There's good reason to worry about unintended bad effects of biomedical enhancements in general and of IgM in particular. I think that's the most serious worry about biomedical enhancement, is just unintended bad consequences, especially biological ones. Reasonable precaution should be based on an accurate understanding of evolution, not on faulty metaphors like master engineer or seamless web. Now, and also, if you're thinking about whether we should ever engage in IgM, don't make the mistake of thinking that the only purpose of doing it would be to make us better off than we are now. It might be necessary just to keep things from getting worse. That's the Tancredi's point. Notice one huge limitation of this presentation, okay? I've just talked about comparing these two technologies or mechanisms, if you want to call them that, IgM and UGM, in terms of which is better in principle as a means of either improving the human condition or preserving it. That's just a comparison of the facts about the potential scope and limits of the technologies. But it doesn't tell you which one would be better to use, because remember, in the case of IgM, it's not just the technical potential of that kind of intervention that counts, it's the human judgment involved in using it. Right? Remember the dual use problem that might be used for bad purposes too? All I've done is just compare these things in terms of what they can do, what potential these have, as if they were two different devices that we could look at. So you might agree with everything I've said and still conclude that given how fallible and rotten human beings are, that it would just be better if they didn't ever try to use this technology. I think that would be a mistake, because I think the potential for benefit is so great, and the risks of sticking with evolution as usual are really quite horrific. Okay, now this is just a preview of Russell's talk, and I don't want to steal his thunder, but when I said that we might need to use IgM to just keep things from getting worse, I was thinking about situations where there's some environmental threat to us, like increased solar radiation that produces skin cancer or increased pandemics. And those are sort of new environmental problems we have, and we might need to ramp up some of our capacities to deal with them. But Russell has a much more profound worry about sticking with unintentional genetic modification, evolution as usual. That is, he's worried about the fact that human beings have done a very good job recently of buffering themselves, protecting themselves from natural selective forces, in particular through developing scientific medicine and through social practices and institutions like the welfare state, which shield human beings who have certain problems from being winnowed out by natural selection. They're living to reproductive age in ways they wouldn't have before. And so that means that there are lots of genes now being passed on from one human generation to the next that are defective genes, and that can cause very serious problems. So another reason, beyond the reasons that I've given for intentional genetic modification, may be to counteract this process. Let me give you an example of pseudogenization, one from non-humans and one from humans, and then I'll stop the discussion. There are trout, there are fish that live in subterranean streams, in streams in caves, and they never see sunlight. And what's happened is that they've lost their eyes. They don't have functional eyes. Why is that? Because, like with every other organism, they get mutations. But the mutations don't get winnowed out by natural selection. They don't need to be able to see in these circumstances. And so the genes that affect the development of their eyes eventually accumulate enough mutations. Mutations usually have a negative effect. It's rare they have a positive effect. They accumulate enough mutations that the eyes become non-functional. The genes don't express to create the tissues that result in a healthy seeing eye. So you have these trout that have vestigial eyes, okay? Well, the same thing can happen with human beings, and has happened, it appears, in some cases. Human beings don't have as much capacity for tasting bitter taste as our primate ancestors used to have, and as chimpanzees and bonobos have, our closest living species relatives. And the explanation for why human beings are losing their capacity to taste bitter substances is that our remote ancestors adopted cooking of food a long time ago. And cooking food, which chimpanzees and bonobos have not done yet, cooking food destroys a lot of toxins. And it turns out that toxicity in plants is strongly associated with bitter taste. And when human beings don't need to depend upon bitter taste, what happens? Well, like with other genes, the genes that find expression in human taste receptors for bitterness accumulate mutations. The mutations aren't winnowed out by natural selection because you don't need to be able to taste bitter things in order to survive. And eventually the genes become non-functional. They become pseudogenes. So that's enough of a teaser for Russell's talk. I highly recommend it. It's very interesting. Thank you. Russell will take questions. Yes.
I can see that. I mean, you're talking about you're juxtaposing two different technologies as evolution. One is like nature's, I guess, about possible humans, and how the second one, the one you go for, I mean, leaves room for human judgment, which is a good thing to have.
Good and bad.
Yeah, good and bad. But I mean, I guess just to push you on the bad one. I mean, how come? In the way you justify, I mean, I guess your perspective on human intervention. I mean, how come, I mean, how does human, I guess, intended modifications avoid the three vices of the natural one? I mean, being pickle, mortal blind, and shackled. I mean, it seems that human interaction is also shackled, and also perhaps fickle if you think that, for example, human beings, what they need or how they, see their comfort zone, they may change over time, and mortal blindness can also come into the picture.
Good, great. First, let me just sort of reemphasize something you alluded to. Just as a sort of thought experiment, think of ordinary evolution as a kind of machine or device for making changes, and then think of intentional genetic modification as a different kind of machine or device. Okay. Now, if you could just program the second machine in the appropriate way, so that it made the right interventions all the time, and it followed these heuristic guidance things, then you'd say, look, it's really superior to the other machine, because just as a machine, it has all sorts of possibilities for doing good for human beings that the first machine doesn't have. And we know it's going to realize that potential because it's been programmed in the right way. But of course, we can't program it in the right way. How this new machine is going to be used depends upon us. But paradoxically, I've been arguing all along that we're very flawed, right? So the question is, are we so flawed that we won't be able to use this wonderful technology to get rid of some of our flaws? That's the question. And sometimes I think this is just a matter of sort of how optimistic or pessimistic you are about what human beings can do. I think human beings have actually already enhanced themselves in lots of ways without biotechnology. Literacy is a huge cognitive enhancement, for example. And I think we've actually morally enhanced ourselves in some ways, because I think many human beings now actually think that the lives and interests of strangers matter to some extent. We don't always act on that appropriately. But for the first time, our moral horizons are much wider than they were when we lived in these very small, relatively isolated hunter-gatherer groups. So the question is, with all our imperfections, are we trustworthy enough to use this very powerful, potentially beneficial technology? And I think that question looks different depending on whether you think the technology is just going to be used to improve our situation compared to the status quo, or whether we might have to use it to prevent a radical deterioration of our current condition. And if we have to use it to prevent a radical Alzheimer's dementia and for treating narcolepsy, uncontrollable falling asleep, but all of these drugs actually improve normal cognitive function. And so my students take them to study for exams, for example. It's a big thing in the United States. It's a huge underground kind of industry of people illegally taking these drugs. I think that IGM is, if we're ever going to use it, it's pretty far down the line. And so the reason I addressed it is that people worry the most about it because it seems the most radical. But on the other hand, it's probably not the most likely thing that we're going to have to cope with. And I think many of the other biomedical enhancement technologies are inherently much less risky and much more containable. We can do good clinical trials on these cognitive enhancement drugs and administer them to a small number of people and do long-term observations, see what happens to them, find out if they work, find out if they're risky. And if there are problems, they'll be relatively contained. If we bring this all out in the open, right, and treat this as a regular medical technology, as long as it's coming in under the radar, you have tens of thousands of American college students taking these drugs and nobody's monitoring it and there's no clinical trials, who knows what's going to happen? So I think for many biomedical enhancements, they're not so different from things we're already doing. So we should have some confidence that we can handle those. But now, I mentioned one other thing you mentioned, that is the fickleness point. Look, suppose, there is this risk, right? If we made some IgM type intervention to cope with some current problem arising from the environment, like skin cancer or something like that, there's always the worry that it would have some unintended consequence in the future, right? That when that environmental problem no longer exists, you won't be getting the benefits anymore, but it'll have some cost that we weren't aware of. So we have to exercise a lot of good judgment about when to make interventions on a large scale, at least, Because something might be, it's the old point, something might be adaptive now, but it becomes maladaptive if the environmental situation changes. That problem won't go away. It's just that if we do make a mistake like that, we can correct it more quickly, I think, than if, quote, nature makes that mistake in ordinary evolution. Yes?
I have one pedantic question and a more serious question. The pedantic question is, towards the beginning of your talk, you suggested that the evolutionary mechanism is necessarily suboptimal. Why the necessity claim? I mean, I can see that it would tend to be suboptimal, but why necessarily?
Well, necessary might be too strong. I'm not sure. I'd be interested to see what Russell says about this. But I guess the point is that if you understand how natural selection works, you can predict that there are going to be a number of problems of the kind. It's not something that, if it's working properly, you won't have these problems, and there's some aberrations, or there's some exceptional circumstances where you get these problems. Given the limitations of how it works, you're going to have these problems. Necessary may be too strong, but predictable. There are predictable, unavoidable kinds of problems.
Predictable.
Okay.
I'm
Much better than necessary. Necessary makes it sound like it's a logical truth or something, or it's implied by the concept of natural selection. I'm not sure I want to say that.
Maybe one thing you could add to it is that, which I think is important to add. So you're always in a dangerous ground to claim that something's necessarily so in the empirical realm, right? But when you think about we talk about optimality from an evolutionary biological standpoint, like the way it's used in the literature of biology, what is optimality? There's actually a huge debate about that. What does it mean to produce an optimal adaptation, right? Well, there was quite a bit of debate about that for at least a decade or so in biology and philosophy of biology. And sort of the conclusion that everyone's reached is what optimality basically means is that there are no incremental changes to the genotype, to the gene, that could increase the fitness of the organism. Now, the incremental is a crucial adjective because, of course, when we think optimality, we're thinking, well, it's the best of sort of all possible worlds, right? But that's not what evolution does, because it can't sort of produce simultaneously a whole suite of genetic changes that happen to do the right thing all at the same time. So that's not what biologists mean when they say something is optimal. So I think if you're trying to say, well, what do we mean to say that it's not it's necessarily suboptimal? If you think of optimality in that sort of more grandiose sense, then you will probably come to the conclusion that the biological realm is pervasively, if not necessarily, suboptimal because of that incrementality constraint. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And the point is that IGM isn't constrained by incrementality, right? Because instead of having to make, suppose that to get some important phenotypic change, you have to have a whole sequence of genetic changes, and they have to be in the right order, and if any one of them doesn't occur, you don't get it. For that to happen through natural selection, the odds are very low that's going to happen. But if you can change all the genes at once in the embryo, or in the gamete, then you can get that result. It's not incremental. That's a huge difference. Or it needn't be incremental.
My second question is, it's a way of maybe bringing back the metaphor of seamless web. So even though the organisms may be modular, there may be certain properties and their distribution within the population may require them to be a certain distribution. So I don't remember this very well, but I remember reading about evolutionarily stable game strategies or something along those lines. So you have altruists and you have, let's say, egotists, and for one strategy to be stable, there has to be a certain distribution of them in a population. So when you look at the changes you bring about in the individual, so let's say you make an individual more altruistic, what can be better than that? Maybe one risk could be that it changes the distribution of, it makes the strategy open to attack. So if you have a certain amount of, let's say, altruists, and you increase that trait, and then you have these selfish individuals who may become about through some mutations, then there may be the risk that that takes over.
Yeah. Actually, I think this is a really interesting issue. When people talk about intentional genetic modification, one question always is sort of on what scale, right? And you're right, suppose that some subpopulation of humans undertook some moral enhancement, made themselves more altruistic. There are problems about what altruism is and whether we'd ever be in a position to make genetic changes that have some significant influence on something that complex, but suppose that were true. But suppose that not all humans had this change. So now you have a group of very altruistic, let's say very trusting humans, and then lots of humans that are just like you and I, not very altruistic, maybe not very trustworthy. Then the new altruist might be very vulnerable to exploitation by the other people, right? And so a lot depends on sort of what the scale is. I mean, moral enhancements I think are difficult. We already know that some naturally occurring hormones like oxytocin can increase trust in humans. If you raise the oxytocin levels in the brain, people will show more trust in certain situations, and they may cooperate better in cooperative games. There are studies about this. I don't think the conclusion to draw is, let's engineer everybody with lots of oxytocin, because you'd have to wonder, who are they willing to cooperate with? You don't want them cooperating with the Nazis, for example, right? You don't want them cooperating in a massive genocide, right? There was high levels of trust and cooperation among the Hutus in Rwanda in 1994, which enabled them to massacre about 800,000 Tutsis in their own country, right? So there's that problem, but then there's also this problem of the distribution. Another thing people worry about is they think that, and this doesn't sound unreasonable to me, that sometimes there are good social effects of having a distribution of some trait like intelligence, right? And even some differences in people's capacity for altruism or other things, that there's a kind of complementarity of traits that has some beneficial effects, and that evening that out so that everybody, even if everybody raised up to a higher level of whatever the trait is, it wouldn't be a good thing to have the same level of some very beneficial traits. I think those are all important considerations, and they, what it may mean is that thinking about unintended bad social consequences may be much harder than thinking about bad unintended biological consequences. Now that might be that, because we know more about how genes function, at least in mice, than we know about how society, how things are related in society. The social conservatives have an a priori position on this. They just think that society is a seamless web, and they think that we will never understand it well enough to intervene, either biologically or directly in a social way, without getting into serious trouble. And I don't think there's any reason to believe that. The heuristics that we propose here are designed to be knowledge sensitive. That is, they're to make you focus on the question of how much knowledge you have that's relevant to an intervention, and point you in the direction of getting more knowledge of the relevant sort. In this case, knowledge of causal connections in the ontogenic process. So a lot's going to depend upon whether our knowledge keeps increasing and whether we're smart enough to use the knowledge in operating this machine or in undertaking other modes of biomedical enhancement other than IgM, things like drugs. But the complementarity of traits thing, that's an interesting idea.
Yeah, sure.
Yes?
I think earlier you mentioned about some of the bad designs or sort of thing. Would you say, for example, that if the environment were constant, there was no change in the atmosphere from temperature to whatever the smallest detail you can imagine, everything is constant, would evolution in such a world be called progress or betterment if it ever happens? I don't know.
Okay, go ahead. Here's the real biologist over here. Go ahead.
Well, so, but in fact, there's that effect that Alan was referring to called this, it's a hypothesized, although there's quite a bit of empirical research that's been done over it, called this Red Queen effect from Alice in Wonderland. This queen who's running in place just to stay where she is. Now that effect is supposed to apply even in cases, and the empirical work suggests that it applies, even in cases where the environment, in the ways you describe the environment, are static. They don't change, they're constant. And that's the finding, that's the observation. So you look at the you look at the fossil record, and you look at all these different lineages, all different types of, all sorts of animals, and that's the finding. So even where you have constant environments, as far as we can tell, you still have this need to constantly change, or else you go extinct. And what explains that is the strategic interaction of predators and preys, organisms of the same species, males and females, whatever it is. This constant, perpetual strategic interaction between species, between populations, within individuals.
Even if all the other environmental factors.
Even if everything else is the same.
Which is another way of saying that if you have an inclusive view of the environment that includes interactions within and between species,
you can't have a static environment.
You never have a static environment.
Suppose you isolate the species. What happens?
Okay. Well, everything.
Put them in a laboratory. Yeah. Because there would be, for example, sexual selection would still be going on, right?
No
But you still might not. In fact, in that case, you still might not get optimality. That's sort of what that seemed to be what you were getting at, right? So in the case where you had a truly static environment, both the biotic environment, meaning the different species, and the abiotic environment, meaning the climate and the pollution, and whatnot, all of those things are exactly the same over time. Then the question becomes, well, should we expect natural selection to now, if any time is going to optimize, now is the time it's going to optimize, right? Well, that's to some extent true, but again, you still have this incrementality problem. So what's optimal for selection may not be optimal for a forward-looking, thinking agent like we are. But the second is that natural selection is not the only force in evolution. So it's far from guaranteed, and there's a very, very intense debate on this question about what are the most important forces in evolution. Whether natural selection is the most important force, whether there are other forces, like things that they call genetic drift or just drift. Other forms of change over time that have nothing to do with fitness differences between organisms. The question is, which one is relatively more significant? Now, if it turns out that the non-selective modes of change are relatively more significant than selective modes of change, and by the way, the answer to that depends on, we're talking about large populations, small populations, there's a lot of factors that play a role. But if that's the case, then even in a static environment, inclusive static environment, you still might not get optimality because the selective forces will be overwhelmed by these essentially random forces that prevent optimality. Right. And that's an open question.
Optimality implies also there is some end, no? Where perfectness to achieve it.
You talk about the IgM and also the social unintended effects of IgM.
Not in this paper.
But
Not in this
elsewhere.
paper.
Especially given the kinds of societies that
yeah, I mean,
what it might lead to.
yeah, it might be that it's a perfectly good machine for some societies, just not for the one we're in, right? That there might be social forces that make it a dangerous thing,
or even have the unintended consequence of weakening the social institution,
yeah,
the
I think,
welfare state.
yeah, a lot's going to depend, I think, on whether, on the scale that the technology is used on, and whether in some reasonably short time period it's going to be available to everybody, or most people, right? I mean, some people worry about a situation where it's sort of like what you were saying with the altruists, where you have a subpopulation that gets radically enhanced, and they're so different from the unenhanced people that they can't live in the same society with them, at least not on roughly equal terms. The only way they can live in the same society is by dominating them, right? It'd be like a new elite. That's a worry that some people have. And some people worry that either the super enhanced people would actually have a higher moral status than unenhanced people, in the way that many of us think we have a higher moral status than dogs and cats or rats do. That there'd actually be a difference in moral status. Or that the people that were super enhanced would treat the unenhanced as if they were inferiors, as if they were the way many of us treat non-human animals now. But even if it didn't go that far, there might be a question of social cohesion, right? It might be that if you had a number of generations of a subgroup enhancing itself in some significant way, and other people not doing it, that you'd really get such differences that it was very hard for these people to view themselves as having a common citizenship or having being members of the same society. And so one question to complement, I guess, that connects with earlier work that I did that's not in bioethics, is whether there might be a kind of genetic secession where groups would split off and sort of form their own societies in some way. So I think there are worries about social cohesion like that, but there are also just these issues about distributive justice. If biomedical enhancements are only available to the very best of people already, then that will magnify existing inequalities. I think, again, it might be good to look at something other than this radical kind of thing, IgM. Think about cognitive enhancement drugs. I don't think we should assume that they're going to be very expensive or they're going to remain expensive. Because if drugs, at the end of the patent period on a drug, they become very cheap to produce and are sold at very low cost. At Walmart in the United States, in the pharmacy department, there's a list of over 120 drugs, and a month's supply of them, these are prescription drugs, medical drugs, cost only $4, okay? That's 30 times less than going to Starbucks every day, okay? And if you have a cognitive enhancement drug that really works, when the patent runs out, it will be produced generically, and the price you would expect to go down very, very low. But also, if governments become interested in cognitive enhancement drugs and come to view them as something like basic education, as something that's beneficial to society, increases productivity, makes Turkey a stronger economic player in the world, then governments may subsidize access to these drugs. So, you know, whether there's going to be a problem of injustice, the haves and the have-nots, is really will depend on a number of factors. It's going to depend on how high the cost is. If the cost isn't very high, then they'll be widespread if they're beneficial. But also, they may not remain simply consumer goods on the market. They may in some cases be subsidized by the state in the way that public education is now subsidized. That is something that's just thought every citizen needs it. But I think the distributive justice issues are serious issues. Intentional genetic modification might be very, very expensive, right, for the foreseeable future, if not forever. But some other interventions, especially drug interventions for enhancement, are not going to remain expensive for very long. You know, there are technologies that become very cheap very quickly and diffuse very widely, and there are others that don't. Cell phones are my favorite example of a technology that has diffused with incredible rapidity. Now there are, you know, poor peasants in rural Pakistan who have cell phones and are organizing political activity and economic life using cell phones. And 15 years ago, people would have thought that cell phones were going to be luxury toys for the very rich. So one question is, how can you make these technologies more rapidly available to more people? That's what we've got to think about. I think you can stop these technologies, even if we wanted to. It's a question of how we're going to manage them, and one of the big questions is whether we can, if they really are beneficial and safe, we can more rapidly make them available to more people.
My worry was more that it was sort of take the place of education.
Okay, good. I actually have written a paper on this because I talked to a bunch of educators at a conference.
Just feed them some pills and stuff.
Yeah. Okay.
Good instruction.
I think that's a natural worry, but I think it's founded on a misperception of how these things would work, okay? It's not that you're going to take the Latin pill and all of a sudden you'll know Latin grammar. It's rather that you're going to take a pill that will increase your ability to concentrate So it's not going to replace ordinary education. It's going to make ordinary education more efficient. I think that's, and similarly with performance-enhancing drugs in sports, okay? You can't take a pill and become a great football player, right? It doesn't work like that. You take some pills and it enables you to train harder, and it enables your body to recover more quickly between intense training periods. It's not a substitute, okay? Barry Bonds, the famous baseball player in the United States who was found to have been using performance-enhancing drugs, is, according to everybody who knows about him, the hardest practicing player in professional baseball. He's the guy that stays after everybody else has quit practicing and continues to run laps and continues batting practice. And taking the enhancement drugs simply enable his body to recover more quickly from these intense, horrible training exercises that he does. And I think cognitive enhancement is like that. My students that take these drugs, they don't take the drugs and then not study. Okay? They take the drugs because it enables them to study longer and to be more focused in their studying and to get more out of their studying. So I don't think it's ever going to be a substitute for education. I think it's something that could improve the efficiency of ordinary educational techniques. That's how I would see it. I mean, it would be, I would love to be able to take a pill and speak perfect Turkish. That would be great. I'd love to be able to do that. But most I could hope for is that I could take a drug that would help me concentrate more on learning how to speak Turkish. Thank you.